called Genie, and the topic of today is going to be the fact that certain empires are more important than others. In fact, you could even call certain empires foundational in how they have shaped later civilization. I'm here going to discuss 3 empires that could be considered to be fundamental to understand a civilization's development and origins. First is the Roman civilization and empire. From the Republic to the Empire. Rome is the forefather of European civilization. I include here both the West and Russia, even if they could be argued to be separate civilizations. The second, quote, empire, unquote, is the Caliphate. From the Rashidun Caliphate to the Abbasids, as being the forefathers of Islamic civilization. The third is the Qin and Han dynasties of China, as being the forefathers of later dynasties. I could have added more examples of foundational empires than this, but I chose these 3 because they are 3 very clear examples of empires having a great effect upon later civilization. Let's start with Rome and its influence upon European civilization. The fact that we even use the word empire is a testament to the influence of the Roman Empire upon us. Empire, after all, comes from the Latin word imperium, which is the word for authority in Latin. And the word for emperor comes from imperator, commander, and from the name of Julius Gaius Caesar comes several names for rulers. Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, Kejsare in Swedish. The fact that we have representative democracies in the West can be attributed in part to the legacy left by the Roman Republic, or Res Publica, as the Romans called it. The same is also true of the United States government. I mean, even one of the parliamentary chambers is even called the Senate, the same as the Roman Chamber of Representatives. And Roman law is the basis for many judicial systems in the West. The Western judicial system owns its very beginnings in the Roman concepts of courts, in the Roman concepts of law. And Rome is the reason why Christianity is the dominant religion upon the European continent. And it's in its Roman form Christianity was spread in Europe and later into the rest of the Western world during colonization through the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches that have their origin in the Roman Church. Western civilization can be defined by its will to resurrect the Roman Empire in various forms, either trying to imitate the Republic or the Empire at its various stages. But it's important to state that Rome was not the same civilization as the Western world, European world. There are large differences that I will go into another video to explain. Rome is more of the father of Western civilization rather than the same civilization in its early stage. European civilization can almost be called to be like a child crying over his dead father, filled with guilt due to having killed him. We can see several attempts, or what I will refer to as imitator empires, to try to resurrect or imitate the Roman Republic or Empire. First we have the Renaissance, which is literally the rebirth of the classical, and classical in this case often meant Roman, or the Greeks, whose influence the Western world got through the Roman influence and the Roman Empire. But even before that, we had a Carolingian Renaissance, where Charlemagne, or Carolus Magnus, tried to resurrect the Western Roman Empire after it fell. And this tradition also went into the later Holy Roman Empire, which in turn ultimately was toppled by Napoleon, who, like the Roman emperors of old, crowned himself emperor with a laurel crown. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire also meant that the title of emperor came up for grabs afterwards, and a lot of monarchs in Europe styled themselves as emperor or empresses afterwards, all pointing towards the imperial legacy of Rome. We have imperial traditions outside of the Holy Roman Empire and the Western tradition. For example, Tsarist Russia, as the word Tsar was adopted as a title, and Russia named itself the Third Rome after the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. You also have the United States that adopted a lot of Roman ideas and saw itself almost as a new Roman Republic. And in modern history, you have both the Nazis and the fascists adopting a lot of symbolism coming from the Roman Empire. It is undeniable that Rome has had a huge influence on European civilization. Actually, the word civilization in itself comes from Latin, as Latin has had enormous impact upon the languages of the West, with its vocabulary finding its way into almost all languages, making a large part of most Western languages' vocabulary. Either this was directly, as Latin was used as the cultured language of the educated for over a millennia, or it was through borrowing from other languages that had already borrowed or evolved from Latin. And the modern day Latin languages is the Romance languages that descend from Latin, have several hundreds of millions of speakers. Ironically enough, mostly outside of the confines of the old empire. There's a reason why we call South America Latin America, after all. So the Romans have left a legacy there, though by proxy through the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers. We also see the Roman legacy in the Latin alphabet and its later spread. Without understanding Roman influence upon European civilization and the trauma connected with its fall in the European popular imagination, it's impossible to understand European civilization. Similarly, it would be impossible to understand Islamic civilization without understanding the legacy of Muhammad and the caliphal power that existed for 300 years afterwards. From the Rashiduns to the Abbasids, this was a period where the Arabs that had conquered the Middle East flourished and established what was going to be Islam as we know it. A golden age of cultural development, similar to the European imagination about the Pax Romana and the Roman Empire during its golden age. In the popular view among Muslims, it is seen as a period of prosperity where Islam laid the framework for a prosperous society. The early period of these 300 years saw the development of Islam as we knew it with all the religious sources, such as the Quran, the Hadith and the Sirah, and the later period saw the development of the legal schools with regard to Islamic law, and even later the theological traditions took their shape during the Abbasids. These legal traditions and theological schools are used even to today in both law and in other matters of religion. Similarly to how the legal traditions of Rome are still living in the Western law tradition. And just like how certain rulers wanted to claim ownership of the title of emperor after the dissolution of the Roman Empire, the same was also true about the caliphal title in the tradition of successorship from Muhammad. This includes both Arabic rulers and non-Arabs, like the Turkish Ottomans, who claimed the caliphal title from the Abbasids after a scuffle in Egypt. The Ottoman Empire is actually very interesting in that it laid claim to both the legacy of Rome and the caliphal tradition. So it was influenced by both foundational empires as an imitator empire, not that dissimilar from the imitator empires trying to imitate Rome in Europe. This is a reminder that Islamic civilization is greater than just the Arab world, but let's not forget that Islam had its origin in the Arabic power structures of the 17th to the 10th century, and the caliphates from the Rashidun to the Abbasid period are responsible for why Arabic is spoken by several hundreds of millions of people around the world, and why so many languages have borrowed Arabic words. And this influence is not just in the Islamic world. Even a lot of words found in the Western languages have their origin in Arabic. Arabic has had a very similar influence as Latin, though it could be argued to have been even greater, as Arabic is the language that you use to recite the Quran. Speaking about the Quran and Islam, this history of a golden age of Islam with about 300 years is also one of the reasons as to why the political situation looks so different in the Arabic world with regards to secularization and other things in comparison to the West, because theocratic rule or rule by religion worked during this time, and thus there doesn't exist the same sort of negative connotations as in the West, and Islam never developed a theory of two separate spheres in the same way as Western Christianity did, as it is a legacy of Latin Roman influence, particularly the Roman tradition of natural law, jus naturale. Instead, what developed was a theory of justice through divine command during this period. This has had various effects. It ensured certain legal rights, as it was harder to argue away them, but it also did hamstring certain rulers, limiting their legislative authority and preventing the development of a natural law that was legitimate outside of just divine command, as the Islamic law, the Sharia, with its various interpretations, took precedence over the man-made laws of various leaders, at least in the ideal cases. In reality, it's much more complex than this. There exists this view that Islam and its various rules works as a counterbalance to the injustice of earthly rulership. And we have to remember that Islam is the second largest religion on earth. So this legacy of divine law controlling rulership is long. Though, as is the case with all civilizations, exceptions exist, and the modern Arab world, for example, as I am going to focus upon it, as that is where I am most familiar with, has taken a lot of modern influences from the Western world. And just like Roman civilization was very influenced by the Greeks, the Arabs actually adopted a lot of Greek philosophy and thought into their thinking during the height of the 3 caliphates. And they also invented new stuff based upon Greek thinking and upon improving what had been done before, which in turn was later spread to the West. Though this is a very complicated affair which requires its own dedicated video. Like in the case of Rome, but lasting for a much shorter period, the Abbasid Caliphate eventually fell and lost its political power through a gradual process. Difference between this and the fall of Rome is that there was no civilizational collapse as in the case of Rome with the Arabic Abbasid Caliphate. In fact, the civilization continued, and even though there are large differences between the modern Arabic world and the Arabic world of the past, I mean, it's back in the Middle Ages, of course there are going to be huge differences. You can still see civilizational lines here much more clearly than you can between the Roman world and the Western world. The Abbasid period was just the younger phase of the Arabic Islamic world, not a separate civilization. So it was not as drastic as the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Abbasid lasted as a kind of ceremonial entity for a long time, but were eventually disposed, though the title of caliph and leader of the faithful within the Islamic faith did survive, as the concept of caliphate is not a singular state, but rather an entity that protects a faith, and it continued within, for example, the Ottoman Empire, until it was dissolved due to Kemal Atatürk's reforms, the year 1924, thus marking the end of caliphal tradition. And this, although not as extreme as the fall of Rome, this has had an impact upon political development in the Islamic world, with Islamists trying to revive the glory days, and especially the period around the time of Muhammad, through bringing back what they see as the political order that existed back then, with an Islamic law ensuring justice. Of course, the reality back then was usually a lot more complex, and when they say Islamic law, they usually just mean their own interpretation of it. After all, there exists a lot of groups within Islam, and I have made a video about it previously. You can see the link in the description. But anyway, the important thing is that Islamists actually share a lot of similarity to various Roman revivalist movements in European history, as the Islamists and those movements I mentioned wants to revive the lost empires. In that regard, both are actually very similar, though the nature of these two entities, the Caliphate and the Roman Empire, were quite different. But in their influence, they are quite similar in their legacy, still affecting the past and the present in our views of it. But now to the third foundational empire, Qin and Han China. It was during this period that China as a centralized empire and its bureaucratic traditions developed. For example, the philosophy of legalism developed during the Qin dynasty, based upon the teachings of Shang Yang. Don't ask me how to pronounce these Chinese names, as I cannot speak Chinese. Anyway, legalism is pretty much the philosophy that everything should be subordinated to the state, and the purpose of the state is to uphold order and expand, and everything should be directed towards that goal. And also, this means that families, as in clan structures and the like, should be fought against, and meritocratic advancement, or at least what counts as meritocratic in this cultural context, should be promoted. instead of being based on familial ties. And the old should be thrown out, as it impedes the strength of the state. And everything that is against this philosophy or ideology should be removed. Thus, book burnings were a thing during the Qin dynasty. Now, legalism has some aspects that almost seem modern. It is important to remember that it was an ideology developed in order to strengthen the centralized state in a context of decentralized power and clan structures. Thus, a lot of the laws based upon legalism are extremely harsh, even with the standards of that time. Actually, it was the harshness of these legalist laws that actually caused a rebellion that made Qin fall and be replaced by the Han dynasty. Though legalism still managed to actually influence a lot of Chinese history through implementing an ideal of a meritocratic bureaucracy that was usually the case through most ages. In the ideal, if not in practice. And now we will go into the other philosophy that developed during the Han dynasty, or rather, that was promoted into its more codified form during the Han dynasty, and that is Confucianism, based on Confucius, who promoted familial ties and obligations due to tradition, and rather than promoting an order based upon a centralized state, it was an order based upon the harmony of the family in a greater context, thus pretty much the opposite of legalism. These were established during this period as two very strong currents of thought throughout Chinese history, and every following dynasty built upon these foundations and upon the culture of centralized statesmanship that the Qin developed. Actually, I find the development of the two philosophical schools of legalism and Confucianism to actually be quite similar in some regards to the development of the schools of fiqh or jurisprudence within Islam during the Abbasid period, especially Confucianism, how it acts like a counterweight to the imperial authority almost, in a way, against the centralized authority. Kind of like how there exists laws that counteract excessive abuses by the centralized government. Confucianism, for example, involved the concept of the mandate of heaven, which said that if the emperor is becoming unjust, he will lose the right to rule and should be disposed. There exist very similar concepts within Sharia law. The Qin and the Han have had a huge impact on Chinese development with these philosophies, and has been seen almost as the quintessential empires, thus they are the foundational empires for China. And regarding the mandate of heaven and centralized state, every time a Chinese empire has fallen into disarray, there has been a period of warring states and massive upheaval, but there has always been this idea of reunifying China into one large empire again, based upon the precedents set by the Qin, thus regaining the mandate of heaven and the right to rule for a monarchical dynasty. You see that this is quite similar to the revivalist movements I have discussed before in both the Islamic world and in the Western European world. Also, regarding the mandate of heaven, if, again, an emperor becomes corrupt, then you are supposed to do rebellion, and this tradition has lived through Chinese history, even to this day. The Hong Kong protesters and the protests in Taiwan with the sunflower movement all used the mandate of heaven concept in their rhetoric, similarly to how Westerners would use the concept of natural law and human rights to argue against an abusive government, or how people in the Islamic world would use laws against corrupt leadership and divine law to argue against oppressive rulers there. And regarding legalism, actually, Mao Zedong actually did praise the Qin Empire for the revolutionary zeal of getting rid of the old and creating a strong state, and praised Shang Yang, the legalist founder of the legalist school, as a great inspiration for him. So what developed in communist China wasn't so much a total break with history, but rather just another Chinese empire. This one a little bit more towards the legalistic side of things. Now with Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, we are also seeing a move towards more Confucianism. And now, when I've gone through these three periods that are foundational, or these three foundational empires, it is important to note how they have influenced later development. By being these sorts of great empires that came before and that everyone looks up to, they have all left a legacy that is undeniable. From the tradition of centralized absolute monarchy of the Chinese emperors, to the republicanism of Rome and dictatorship of the Roman emperors, to the caliphate and caliphal authority of the successorship of the prophet. These are traditions that have left a huge legacy and legitimacy behind them in regards to how we deal with everything from justice to our political systems. These are the empires that have been imitated, as they are the progenitors of civilisations. Despite these large empires being gone for more than millennia, they still have served as inspiration for countless empires afterwards, and they still serve as inspiration for countless peoples and movements in everything from law to our sense of ethics and politics and religion. The idea of a foundational empire and its legacy is crucial to understand history, and I hope that I have made clear the importance of these foundational empires and their similarity in influence. Please push the like button, as it helps this channel. Please do subscribe, as it would help this channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.